Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is Paul Levinson. He is Chair of Communications and Media Studies at Fordham University here in New York City. He is also the author of both fiction and nonfiction books. His nonfiction works include the books The Soft Edge, A Natural History and Future of the Information Revolution, and Digital McLuhan. He has been interviewed over 500 times in various TV and radio appearances. I was wondering if you could give us kind of a sense of where you think media is right now, because it's a very complicated world right now. There's a lot of media chaos going on, but it's an interesting time.
You'll be happy to hear. I think media are going in the direction of exactly what you're doing.
I'm very happy.
But I think it's crystal clear, really, that first of all, conventional broadcast television is on its way down. And I never cheer the demise of a medium, but on the other hand, they pretty much, had a stranglehold on a certain level of discourse going back really to the late 1940s, as radio did before that.
Right.
And cable television began making inroads on that in the 90s. But nowadays, actually, as far as I can tell, the action is on the internet. It's on Blip TV, the Alcove. It's on YouTube. Look at the Obama Girl video, all the impact and good or bad that did.
Yeah.
And this is where the consumer can at last become a producer. That's the key. The problem with the mass media was always that there was a really negative asymmetrical relationship in which you had a handful of producers and a huge number of consumers. And they tried to disguise that. The New York Times, all the news that's fit to print.
Right.
I don't think so. It's really all the news that a small group of editors at the New York Times deems fit to print. But that doesn't scan that well. Or Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it was.
Right.
It's not true. It's really, and that's the way a small band of editors here at CBS News thought you should think it was. So, and the mass media still have a role because they're so easy. It's still easier to turn on a television than, get to a computer. But even that's beginning to vanish. People now have iPhones, Blackberries you can get on the web almost instantly. So I think that's really what's happening.
Now, how do you think what some are calling kind of a nicheification, so to speak, with all the podcasts and all the global new media, how do you think that will actually transform the traditional mass media? Do you think it will adapt, or do you think perhaps it might be a bit of a dinosaur? Do you think that it's capable of the kind of change that some hope that it might?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there is an aspect of the mass media which are very similar to the theatrical model. There was a time in Shakespeare's time when theater was the only way you could see that kind of public narrative performance. And although as much as I love theater, let's face it, it really hasn't done all that well in terms of reaching millions and millions of people in an age of motion pictures and television.
Right.
So I think there is that aspect to the mass media. But I also do think that the mass media are highly adoptable and they have something going for them. In the end, it's the same video, it's the same screen. So for example, something like the Alcove, which is now on Blip TV, now on the internet, I wouldn't be at all surprised if sooner or later some mass medium came along to you and said, how would you like the Alcove to be on our airways? And you would certainly say yes, because you want to increase your audience. There are now actually beginning on the internet several news operations television stations which are in effect recruiting material in a YouTube-like fashion so that they can play them on their television.
Looking for new talent, in essence.
That's right. And so to the extent that the media are adoptable in that way, and radio to some extent draws on podcasts, I think that there is a future for mass media, but it'll be very different from what it's been so far.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when you look at things, do you think that in the long term we will be, far richer for a lot of, as you're saying, consumers becoming producers, because there must be a dark side to this new medium, the idea that there is, too much information, for instance, too much superfluous information. Do you think the power of search, do you think the power of the technology will allow us to find the kind of media that we want without being overwhelmed?
Well, first of all, I don't think there is such a thing as information overload.
Okay.
What people are talking about when they worry about that is really information underload. And a way of realizing this is if you walk into a bookstore or a library, there are clearly a myriad more books than you can possibly even think about.
Absolutely.
But yet you don't really feel overwhelmed. You may feel sometimes a brief twinge of where should I look, but basically, most people are fundamentally comfortable in bookstores and libraries. Why is that? It's because since we were kids, we were taught the rules of navigating bookstores and libraries. The thing that's frightening about all this information is we don't know how to navigate it. As soon as we learn how to navigate it, then it becomes effortless and actually inspiring and enlightening.
So how do we do that? That's the thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's happening already. I mean, I think that Google is justifiably successful. I know there are a lot of people, from my perspective, they're almost paranoid. They're afraid Google is taking over the earth. I had some students once trying to convince me of that. But the fact is they're not doing that at all. And what they and other people working on various improved search methods are doing is bringing it all together. And Google itself has evolved. Nowadays on Google you can search for things in blogs, search for things in newspapers, search for things in video, search for books, in addition to everything else that's on the web. So it's never been easier, and it's continuing to improve. I don't really see a dark side to this. The only darkness that ever exists, unfortunately, is the darkness in humanity, meaning that we are capable of bad things as well as good things. And, if you think of technology as being a knife, we can use it to cut food, but people can use it to cut people. There's no technology that's ever been invented that is immune from bad uses. I mean, think about medicine. That seems like to be just good, but yet some lunatics figured out how to make it into germ warfare.
Right.
So that wouldn't have happened before Louis Pasteur and that whole revolution in biology. And on the other hand, what's the worst technology we can think of? Nuclear weapons. But obviously, nuclear energy can have good uses as well. So it's a question of how we use it. And I'm in favor of empowering people because I think, by and large, the good usually succeeds over the bad.
Yeah. It's interesting, in your book, Digital McLuhan, you talk about the legacy, the ideas of Marshall McLuhan. And it's interesting because, I think he died in 1980. What do you think that he would say about the age that we're in right now? I mean, the whole thing of the medium is the message. Would the world that we're in here right now, 2007, 2008, would this be amongst what he would have predicted, or is this maybe even beyond what he would have suggested?
I think McLuhan would be as comfortable in this world as we are, maybe even more comfortable. In fact, having known McLuhan for a few years near the end of his life, it was crystal clear to me he was not comfortable in the world in which he lived. That's one of the reasons why people had trouble even relating to him as a scholar. All of his writings were attempts in both content and form to break beyond the networked, print-bound, early television boundaries that existed in his day. That's why if you pick up a copy of the Gutenberg Galaxy, it's not a conventional book. And, he was talking about things like the global village, which in fact didn't exist in the 1960s when he was talking about that, because it really wasn't a village, and it wasn't global. It was maybe national, but even then, if everyone was watching the same thing on television, it wasn't really a village because people couldn't interact. The world as it is now has really finally caught up with McLuhan's prescient genius, and I think he'd be very happy.
Yeah, and as you're saying, he didn't fit into traditional notions of what scholarship was. Somebody else like Joseph Campbell, it's kind of a similar thing. There's a lot of academic criticism, but the essential genius of what he did was to sort of bleed over the lines of one single discipline.
Absolutely.
It seems to me.
And the academics who criticize McLuhan and Campbell are either lazy or morons, in my opinion.
Or envious.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely envious.
Yeah.
But I mean, I remember shortly after McLuhan died in 1980, in what would eventually become Digital McLuhan, which wasn't published until 1999, I approached an editor at, I don't mind saying the name of the press, St. Martin's Press. I really can't remember the name of the editor. I said, McLuhan died a few months ago. I have an idea for a book. Do you really think people are interested in that? I said, I know they are. I says, well, a lot of academics may disagree with you.
Yeah.
And I said, well, you think they really understand McLuhan? I can't get into that. So he wasn't really a bad person. He was just a publisher. He was unwilling to buck these academics. There were schools universities that didn't permit students to cite McLuhan in their PhD